The day after humiliating a soldier, he saw her face on the news and couldn't believe what he had done. The sun was setting over Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport as passengers hurried to board their flights, eager to return home. Among them was a woman in uniform, her combat boots firm on the ground, her posture straight, and her expression calm yet focused. She carried herself with a confidence that came from experience, but there was a hint of weariness in her eyes, the kind that resulted from long days away from home. Sergeant Lorraine Bryant, a decorated U.S. Army medic, had just come back from a tough deployment overseas. Tonight, all she wanted was to sit in her seat, close her eyes, and dream of the joy of finally embracing her family after months apart. As she stepped onto the plane, her uniform caught a few glances. Some passengers nodded in respect, while others simply looked away. It didn't bother her. She was used to being overlooked. What Lorraine didn't expect was the man seated just a row behind her. From the moment she walked by, his eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a sneer. She could feel his judgment as she stowed her bag and settled into her seat. He was the kind of man who didn't keep his opinions to himself, and soon the cabin would know that in the most uncomfortable way. As the plane started to fill, Lorraine reached for a small photo tucked inside her jacket pocket. It was a snapshot of her son and daughter, smiling at a 4th of July picnic. That image was her anchor, keeping her grounded no matter how far she traveled. But her quiet moment was interrupted by a loud, sharp voice full of disdain. "Figures," the man scoffed loudly, his voice slicing through the cabin chatter. "Of course they'll let just anyone wear the uniform these days." Lorraine chose not to react. She kept her eyes on the photo, inhaling deeply. But the man continued, "I don't even know why they bother. What's she doing? Handing out band-aids? She's never seen real action." Yet Lorraine had experienced more than action. She had saved lives, faced unimaginable horrors, and stood in places where most wouldn't dare to go. For now, though, she opted for silence. The murmurs in the cabin faded as passengers turned to listen to the man's voice. A few exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. Lorraine remained still, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo in her hand. She had faced far worse than hurtful words, and still, this moment, filled with blatant disrespect, settled uncomfortably in her chest. The man leaned back in his seat, clearly enjoying the attention. He looked to be in his late 40s, dressed casually in a polo shirt and khakis, his expression smug. "You know," he continued, as if speaking to the entire cabin, "real soldiers, the ones who do the heavy lifting, don't need a parade just for showing up." "It's all for show these days." Lorraine's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. The woman next to her, a young mother with a toddler on her lap, whispered softly, "Are you okay?" Lorraine nodded, offering a faint smile. She felt no need to defend herself to a stranger. Her actions and sacrifices spoke louder than any words could. Yet the man wasn't finished. "Bet she's never even left the base," he muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One older gentleman across the aisle leaned forward, opening his mouth to speak, but his wife tugged on his sleeve, shaking her head. "Don't," she whispered. "It will just make things worse." Lorraine remained silent. She had been trained to assess situations, knowing when to act and when to hold back. This was one of those times for restraint. Still, she wondered why this man felt entitled to tear her down without knowing anything about her. Was it her uniform, her skin, or just his own insecurities spilling out in the worst way? The flight attendant, a petite woman with a warm but tired smile, walked briskly down the aisle. She paused near Lorraine's row, her eyes darting between the soldier and the man. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone professional yet firm. "Oh, everything's fine," the man said with a mocking grin. "Just making an observation. Hope I'm not offending anyone's delicate feelings." The flight attendant's jaw tightened, but she simply nodded and moved on, clearly aware of the rising tension but unsure how to diffuse it. Lorraine let out a slow breath. She had dealt with men like him before, those who tested boundaries to see how far they could push. As the plane began to taxi, Lorraine closed her eyes and leaned back in her seat. The man's words continued to echo during the flight, each dripping with condescension, yet Lorraine remained still. Her silence spoke volumes. She knew who she was, what she had done, and what she was capable of. His words might sting, but they could never define her. However, something else lingered in the air, a quiet tension among the other passengers. The man's comments may have been directed at her, but everyone else felt the weight of them. As the plane soared through the sky, Lorraine's thoughts drifted far from the cabin, far from the man and his ignorance. Her mind took her back to the scorching desert heat of Afghanistan, where each day was a test of endurance and bravery. She had been a combat medic for nearly a decade, and her job was not only to heal, but to make split-second decisions that often determined who lived and who didn't. One day in particular stayed with her. She had been part of a convoy delivering medical supplies to a remote village. The route was dangerous, littered with the remnants of past conflicts. Then came the sudden blast, the deafening roar of an IED exploding just ahead of her vehicle. In the chaos that followed, she had to spring into action, pulling injured soldiers from burning wreckage while under enemy fire. Her hands remained steady, her focus unshakable, even as her own safety was at risk. Lorraine didn't do it for recognition. She didn't care about medals or ceremonies. For her, it was about the people she served alongside their faces, their lives. She remembered the young soldier she saved that day, a 19-year-old who had just written home to his mother the night before. His leg was shattered, his face pale from blood loss, but he survived because Lorraine refused to give up. And it wasn't just the soldiers. Lorraine had spent countless hours treating villagers caught in the crossfire of a war they never asked for. She recalled a little girl, no older than 7, injured in a mortar attack. Lorraine carried her to safety, singing softly to calm her until help arrived. That girl's smile, despite the pain she endured, was something Lorraine would never forget. These were the moments that defined her, not the uniform, not the rank, but the lives she touched. Yet, she had also faced battles beyond the battlefield. There were times when her competence was questioned, not because of her skills, but because of her gender and the color of her skin. She had endured snide comments from fellow soldiers and superiors who doubted her abilities. Each time, she proved them wrong, rising above while letting her actions speak louder than their prejudice ever could. Back on the plane, Lorraine opened her eyes, the memories still vivid. She glanced at the man a row behind her, who was now flipping through a magazine, seemingly content with his earlier remarks. She didn't hate him. Lorraine had learned long ago that hatred was a heavy burden to carry. Instead, she felt a quiet resolve. This man didn't know her story, and he likely never would, but his ignorance would never overshadow the truth of who she was. The universe has a way of bringing truths to light, sometimes in unexpected ways, and for Lorraine, the next day would prove just that. The following morning, Mark Reynolds sat in his living room in Albuquerque, sipping his coffee as sunlight filtered through the blinds. His routine was predictable: breakfast, scrolling through his phone, and catching the morning news on Channel 7. He turned on the television, the volume humming to life as the anchor began a segment with a tone of solemn reverence. "This morning, we honor a true American hero," the anchor announced, Sergeant Lorraine Bryant, a combat medic who risked her life to save not only her fellow soldiers but countless civilians during her deployment overseas. Mark froze, his coffee cup hovering midair. The screen showed a photo of a woman in uniform, her expression calm and her presence commanding. His chest tightened. It was her, the woman from the plane. The report continued, recounting the harrowing details of her service. They spoke of the ambush on the convoy, how Lorraine had braved gunfire to rescue the wounded, dragging them to safety even with shrapnel tearing through her own leg. They described her tireless efforts in remote villages, providing aid to innocent families caught in the chaos of war. One of the villagers interviewed in the segment spoke through a translator, saying, "She saved my daughter. If not for her, we would have lost everything. She has a heart of gold." Mark's stomach churned as he set his coffee down, his hands trembling slightly. The anchor went on to describe Lorraine's numerous commendations, including a Bronze Star for her extraordinary bravery. "This is the kind of heroism that often goes unnoticed," the anchor concluded. "Today, we shine a light on the incredible sacrifices made by those who serve, especially those like Sergeant Bryant, who embody the true spirit of compassion and courage." Mark couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. It felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. The woman he had insulted, belittled, and disrespected on the plane was nothing short of a hero. His words from the previous date echoed in his mind, sharp, hateful, and cruel. He remembered the calm in her eyes, how she sat silently as he mocked her. She didn't defend herself or lash out. She didn't have to. Her actions spoke louder than anything he could say. Mark sank into his chair, a wave of shame crashing over him. He had spent years thinking he understood the world, believing his perspective was the only one that mattered. But now, he faced the undeniable truth: he had been so very wrong. Guilt is a heavy thing, and as it settled into Mark's chest, he wondered if there was a way to make things right, or if he would have to live with the weight of his actions forever. He spent the rest of the morning in a daze, replaying the events of the flight over and over in his mind. He recalled the pride in his voice as he mocked her, and the quiet dignity with which she endured his words. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. Now he could almost see her expression as she sat there unmoved, absorbing his hatred without giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. The shame was unbearable. He paced his small living room, his thoughts spiraling. Lorraine Bryant had not only survived unimaginable situations, but she had also carried herself with honor and grace, even when faced with insults unlike him. And what had he done? He had torn her down in public for no reason other than his own insecurities. Mark found himself searching her name online, devouring every article he could find. He read about the missions she had been part of, the lives she had saved, and the sacrifices she made for her family and her country. Her story was extraordinary, yet she had never demanded recognition. She simply did what needed to be done. But the more he read, the heavier the guilt became. His actions on the plane weren't just a moment of poor judgment. They reflected something deeper, something uglier he hadn't been ready to confront. For years, he had clung to biases and assumptions, viewing the world through a narrow, self-serving lens. Lorraine's story shattered that illusion, leaving him face to face with the truth. Mark knew he couldn't undo the harm he had caused. His words had already been spoken, his actions witnessed by an entire cabin of passengers. But he felt compelled to try, even if it was just for his own conscience. He thought about reaching out to the airline to leave a message for Lorraine. But what could he possibly say? "I'm sorry" felt so small, so inadequate. Instead, he decided to act. Mark donated to a veterans organization that provided support for soldiers returning from deployment. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was a start. He also wrote a letter to Lorraine, pouring out his apology in raw, unfiltered honesty. It explained that he had seen the news, that her story had opened his eyes, and that he was deeply, profoundly sorry for his behavior. He ended the letter with these words: "You didn't deserve my hate. You deserved my respect, and I failed to give it to you. I will carry the weight of that failure for the rest of my life, but I promise to do better. Thank you for your service, your bravery, and for being a better person than I ever was." Mark didn't know if the letter would ever reach her, but writing it felt like a step toward accountability. It wasn't about easing his guilt. It was about acknowledging the harm he had caused and committing to change. Sometimes the most profound lessons come not from grand gestures, but from quiet moments of reflection. Mark's journey to understanding was only just beginning. A week later, Mark sat in the same chair in his living room, staring out the window. He didn't know if Lorraine had ever received his letter, or if she ever would, but something had shifted inside him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his ignorance and realized that feeling guilty wasn't enough. Change required action. It required looking beyond surface judgments and truly seeing people for who they are, not who you assume them to be. He turned off the television and sat in silence, thinking about Lorraine. She had taught him something he hadn't been willing to learn on his own. Everyone has a story, and some of those stories carried burdens heavier than most people could ever imagine. The least you can do is offer respect, even when you don't understand, especially then. Mark wasn't a hero, and he never would be. But he hoped in his small way to start living his life with the kind of courage Lorraine showed every day, not the courage to endure on a battlefield, but the courage to confront his own flaws and strive to be better. As viewers, we often hear stories about heroes like Lorraine, and think of them as distant, untouchable figures. But they walk among us every day in flights, in grocery stores, in our neighborhoods, and sometimes we don't even realize their significance until it's too late. So let this story be a reminder. The next time you're about to judge someone based on a fleeting impression, pause, think, and remember that everyone has a story, even if you don't see it right away. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on how you treat the people around you. Let's strive to lead with kindness, understanding, and respect. And if you believe in sharing messages like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that challenge the way we see the world. Because sometimes it's the stories we don't know that teach us the most.